So the first question again was, how do you feel about Houck's model? Where does it fit? Where does it not fit? And then how do we distinguish between normal conflict behavior when we're upset about something and this really unusual and abnormal behavior that Houck's talking about of true antagonism? So I'd welcome your thoughts on either of those questions, but would like to know what you were talking about in your table groups if it went beyond that. So Don has the mic, but he just stepped out of the room. I'm not quite sure why. The cookies were calling, apparently. Oh, there he is. Okay, Don's back. So let's see who's willing to share something from your table group conversation on either of those questions.
My concern is that evil really does exist.
Amen.
And there really are some people that are evil. I don't know that we can always discern who that is. But, I mean, Satan gets in the church, and there are people that are working for him, and sometimes we need to acknowledge that. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I definitely understand mental health issues and personality disorders and all those types of things, and wounded people, but there are evil people.
There are people who do evil things, no question, and that's different than normal conflict behavior. Yeah. Others who are willing to share from your table conversation?
Susan and I both related experiences with a level 5 antagonist in a church, and when that happened to me, and it was between actually not a church member, a non-church member who attended the church, I thought that I was doing something wrong as a pastor.
Yeah.
And I literally backed off. I did not stand my ground because I thought, you know, maybe I've gotten into the wrong profession. Maybe I shouldn't be here. And I was down on myself.
Yeah.
So even though it might be misery loves company, I was glad to hear Susan's story.
Yeah, two really important points, and Houck makes them, but it was my own experience as well. One is you will start doubting yourself, your calling, your skills, your ability, and secondly, you will start to believe that the other person is irredeemable. At least this was my experience. Once I shifted off myself and realized, and other people are saying too, we just can't work with Bruce. And I think both of those are a bridge too far. We are capable human beings, even though our skills aren't working with that person, and that other person is redeemable, just not by the skills we're using. You know, God could still redeem that person. What else?
This is backward in a way, but just picking up on what you said, I think when you start to feel that kind of self-doubt, that can be a signal to you that something is going on that you need to pay attention to, and what is it? Because sometimes you can go so far into your own self-doubt that you really are almost unable to come out of it, and so being able to see that and come out of it. The other thing we talked about was picking up on a pattern of behavior, because times where this had happened, when it happened at our church, we knew of other places this person had been and had sown deep division and pretty well destructed, actually.
Secular.
Yeah, and it was a secular situation. It wasn't another church.
So I'll take it for now. Okay. So the pattern comment, which we picked up earlier, I think that is the most important diagnostic tool. Is this person simply acting inappropriately because of the current conflict, or has there been a pattern of this behavior, destructive behavior?
I know we all want to go home with, okay, what do we do the next time we run into this? Mm-hmm. And something that came out at this table, and I'm beginning to hear it other places, is seek common ground. If you find no common ground, take another route.
Well, we're all beloved children of God, so that's one common ground, but I couldn't find any way of appeasing Bruce, and that's when I started to realize I was dealing with something outside of my skill set. Other things you talked about at your table, or questions that you still have. We're going to spend the last part of the day talking about how to build healthy congregational cultures. So this will be your last opportunity on how to deal with antagonistic individuals or antagonistic behavior. So if you have thoughts that you want to contribute or questions before we break, we'd love to hear them.
This was something that happened with the female clergy were called before the bishop, and there was a discussion about women being raped and run off the road and things like that that were happening in the Methodist Church. And I guess my question is the system really broken when there's discussion about talking to the bishop rather than calling the police on matters like that? I just, that really bothered me to think that maybe there's something that needs to be in place that's a little stronger to protect people from having these things to happen to them. And I don't know how to, but that just stuck with me, and I just can't seem to get it out of my head.
Well, this is a really important point, and I want to say this to pastors as well. What we've learned in universities and what we've learned in churches, if the behavior is criminal, call the police. It is a mistake to attempt to deal with criminal behavior through our traditional church and university processes. It makes things worse rather than better, and it's precisely why the Catholic Church is paying out billions in child abuse settlement fees, because instead of calling the police for child abuse, they tried to deal with it internally. That is a mistake, if I could say that clearly. If it's criminal behavior, call the police or the Child Protective Services or whatever needs to happen to deal with criminal behavior. Our own university procedures have realized that in dealing with Title IX cases.
You walk so quietly. Well, one of the things that brings to mind, when the house caught on fire when I was a little kid, I knew exactly to call the fire department for them to come to deal with the fire. But when Daddy got home, I was anxious to tell him there was no longer a fire. The stove had been put out, but I was anxious to read his reaction. So a lot of times when we tell our supervising individuals above our status, we're anxious to see, do they care? What's their reaction? We know what to do in terms of calling the fire department or the police department, but we still want to know, Reverend, Madam, Brother, do you care about what I'm going through? You know, I got a little pat on the back for doing the right thing. But if Daddy had been indifferent, it would have crushed my feeling.
Yeah.
That makes sense to anybody?
Yes. So even when we call the police department or the fire department, we still want the church to be a caring, compassionate presence alongside. Absolutely.
You know, one of the things that occurs to me is oftentimes we talk in the church about forgiving other people, and that can get in the way, I think, of dealing with these circumstances sometimes. You know, their forgiveness the relationship changes because of certain behaviors. Forgiveness does not mean that you go back to an original state of being. And I think sometimes we forget in these circumstances, and our congregants forget in circumstances. They don't understand what forgiveness is in order to deal with these types of behaviors.
Mm-hmm. that forgiveness may mean remembering so as not to repeat the mistakes that we made in the past.
That's just what you hear from people, well, we just need to forgive them,
Yeah.
And that's not always possible.
I was called in to do a critical incident debriefing on a bank one time where there had been a big embezzlement that had happened, and they were trying to kind of help the folks in the bank kind of deal with that, because it was a dearly beloved person who had done that. And I was talking to the bank manager, and he was kind of like, well, how do you do that? What's your next step going to be? And one of the things that came out was, he says, well, we will forgive this person, but they'll never work with money again.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that's an important distinction. We can forgive them, but there are boundaries then that come into play that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah. And as we would say with a pedophile, we can forgive this person, but he will never work with children again.
Right.
We're not going to do that. So I'm wondering if you could record a couple of things for me yet. And these are just two thoughts about working with individual antagonists. And the first is, don't assume that everyone who disagrees with you is an antagonist. I think that's really important. And not that any of us would, but we can start to go down that path that when somebody strongly disagrees with us, especially if you take how really seriously, you start to see these behaviors pretty naturally. And I've talked with pastors who do. So don't assume that everyone who disagrees with you, with me, is an antagonist. But secondly, if you are dealing with an antagonist, never deal with him, usually, or her alone. I think that's really important, personally. Even though we'll start out that way, all of us do. We start out trying to negotiate, trying to understand, but ultimately, I needed the support of my executive director. We needed the counsel of our attorney to know how to deal with a true antagonist. I was unable to successfully deal with that person alone. So those are my two guidelines, but others in the room have dealt, I think, with true antagonists. Any additional guidelines that you want to recommend at the individual level before we move to the corporate level after break? Documentation, yeah. I started keeping a journal, as was recommended earlier, documenting my interactions. Ended up with a file this thick about one individual, but yeah.
The other question I kind of had was, when I was going through my situation, I think the people I was appealing to that were in my district or conference structure, maybe they had not gone through this type of situation in the past. Mm-hmm. And I did not know to help them understand this was not normal. Is there a way?
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to say it again for people that may not have been able to hear me. When I was going through my situation, I was appealing to district and conference folks that I'm not sure if they understood that this was not normal conflict. And I know that pastors who have never been through this kind of experience, or even district superintendents or bishops, may not understand the dynamic of this if they've never gone through this situation. And so my question is, how do we as people who are in this situation, if we're not believed for that reason, how do we help them understand?
So educational events to look at the difference between simple conflict and genuine antagonism can be helpful. Any other guidelines from your own experience or your own reading of Houck and others?
I think networking is critical.
Yes. Having that confidant outside of your system, talking to other pastors. And again, you'll see the pattern of behavior. It's not a one-off event with a true antagonist. It's a pattern of taking on leaders wherever he or she is.
Well, not just with other pastors, not just just with other pastors, but with other resources in your community
Excellent.
that you can call on, such as somebody like yourself, or like we have Ebenezer Counseling Center here in the city, Dale Berry, and he's always open to a call from a pastor if you have a question about some type of behavior or something like that.
Excellent. Psychotherapists, attorneys, consultants. Yeah. Any final thoughts before we take a break on dealing with individual antagonists? Okay, that's a great list. Could we just read down through it? And I'll do it since I have the mic. Don't assume that someone who disagrees with you is an antagonist, even if they disagree in antagonistic ways. That's where it gets hard. If there is that pattern of behavior, don't deal with an antagonist alone. Document your interactions, networking with people in the community and other pastors that could be helpful to you. And we need to look at system-wide education. Although, again, for me, the education is as much to understand what happens in high-intensity conflict when all of us are capable of behaving badly compared to antagonistic behavior. Okay, let's take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 3 o'clock and talk about strengthening the organism.